I arrived in Manchester in 1980, and I had no mates whatsoever for the first few years, except I just went to a lot of gigs and bought a lot of records, and started a fanzine in 1983 called Debris, and that was my way into the culture really, and I kind of met bands and labels and became part of the community. I think the only time that I ever got a free New Order record was not when I was DJing at the Hacienda and not when I was writing for The Face, but when I was doing a fanzine. And that was the first. I think I got a copy of Brotherhood. One thing about the mid-'80s was that there was that amateurish feel about things. You know, the world wasn't cutthroat, and you could make your mark in quite an informal way. And if you had passion for it, and if you just hung out enough, you could make a contribution. It wasn't about how much money you had behind you, or what contacts you had, or anything like that. It was much more a case of everyone pitching in, and the Manchester music scene, particularly, I think, was very cooperative. You know, a lot you would find in the mid-'80s, a lot of bands sharing rehearsal space. You'd find bands going on tour and taking other bands as a support act, and you'd find people like me putting on little gigs and bands quite happy to play for you. And there was a really good sense of unity, in a sense that everyone was going in the same direction and working for the same aim, which was basically to try and get some acknowledgement for what was happening in Manchester. Like the Stone Roses and Happy Mondays and James and the Inspiral Carpets and bands like that, they'd all been around for 4 or 5 years. It wasn't an overnight thing, it wasn't hype. But because they were in Manchester, they were just that little bit away from the all-seeing eye of the media, and were just able to do their own thing and to, in a way, perfect their art before it went out into the marketplace. Which was why when in the late 80s, suddenly all the media wanted to know about Manchester, there suddenly seemed to be all these great fully formed bands. And the fact is that they'd been forming themselves and working their songs out and finding their own way for 4 or 5 years. One of the key things about Manchester was that if you look back on it, it's quite complicated. On the one hand, you've got all these different bands like the Mondays and the Roses, who are basically indie bands with a bit of a sense of rhythm. And then on the other hand, you've got all these ravers, and you've got the beginning of rave culture. And there was a certain amount of crossover, but there was also a certain amount of tension. But the thing about Manchester was it had a label. And if things have got a label, you can sell it. And Manchester also had the Hacienda, which was a focus for it all. So although I think in other cities you get good activity and you get good bands and you get good clubs, the thing about Manchester was that you actually had the label and you had the club. So almost 4 times a week we played out at the Hacienda what Manchester was all about. So if you had some cynical person saying, oh, Manchester means nothing, you could just invite them down to the Hacienda on a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday or Saturday, and the whole thing is enacted and it's demonstrated and you can't deny it. There weren't clubs that had that aura and created that excitement like the Hacienda, and there wasn't a label that had the very clear identity that Factory had. So there was a whole lot of activity which wasn't to do with Factory, but everything was kind of in the way in Factory's shadow. Well, Factory, I think, was not a great business. It wasn't run like a great business. I don't think it ever was, really. I mean, someone who I know who worked in the accounts department said it was just a mess, it was chaos, that it was a question of stumbling from one Wilson whim to the next, that there wasn't any business plan. Factory, but that was endearing, do you know what I mean? I mean, if it had been very business orientated, they would have made different decisions. There wouldn't have been the creativity, there probably wouldn't have been the crackle of innovation, and it wouldn't have been as as pleasant to work with. It wouldn't have been as endearing. It probably would have survived. I mean, if they'd been better businessmen, factory would still be around now and the hacienda would still be open. Other things, you know, that in the very pot market that are very successful commercially, that would never have credibility. You know, however many times Jerry Halliwell has a makeover, she will never be credible. And yet, however many times Tony Wilson makes mistakes, and he makes loads of them, he always will be.